Hey guys, it's John Michael, and I want to thank you for taking time to tune into the channel. Here at Stregoneria, we like to be able to interact with and engage with our viewers. And one of the questions that we've gotten from several of our viewers, well-meaning questions that were very sincere, was questioning why I refer to our practice as Afro-Sicilian and Southern Italian when I'm an Italian-American, Sicilian-American, and in their minds that seems like cultural appropriation, and they want to know how that's not cultural appropriation or how I feel about that. And so today we're going to talk very briefly about Afro-Sicilian and Southern Italian culture, esotericism, and metaphysical practice, and why it is not appropriative when we use those terms on this channel. So I want to be really clear too that when we use those terms on our channel, it's not cultural appropriation because it is my culture. It is my cultural identity. I'm going to explain why, and I'm going to explain why the argument that's often made about generational factors, being a second generation Sicilian American and a second generation Hungarian Roma, how that, excuse me, in some people's minds seems to be that I shouldn't be able to stake claim to my culture. Cultural identity is personal, and cultural identity depends, in my view, on several factors that we're going to talk about during the course of this video. So first, when we talk about appropriation, appropriation is taking something that's not yours, taking things from a culture that you do not belong to, and then using them for your own personal gain and profit. And so appropriation is wrong. Appreciation is something entirely different. But appropriation, from my perspective as an anthropologist, also includes academic appropriation, which is where we see people who are regarded as or self-proclaimed as academics, as scholars, who misrepresent history, facts, and anthropology for the purposes of making themselves seem more credible, seem more popular, selling books, selling workshops, and so forth. It's important to understand in this conversation the historical context. That when we're talking about Sicilia, we're talking about an island that is separate and distinct from Italy. It has been colonized by Italy. It has been oppressed by Italy. And Italy is the only of the countries to have really put the imposition of oppression upon Sicilia to say you're Italian, period. The island itself, in an historic context, has been ruled by the Ottomans, by pre-Islamic and Islamic North Africans, by the Franks, by the Basque culture, by the Celtic cultures in the ancient world, the ancient Roman cultures, the Greek culture, Phoenicians. There is such a diverse melting pot of cultures that for anyone who's been to Sicilia, they would immediately recognize when you see the Islamic influence merging with some Moroccan influence, with some Basque influence, Roman influence, and you find that in our architecture, you find that in our food, you find that in our language, because there's a common misnomer that Sicilians speak an Italian dialect. And while it's true that in the modern era, there are many Sicilians, particularly the younger ones, who speak Italian, then the simple fact, though, is our native language is Sicilian. And the Sicilian language is a separate language. It is not a Romance language. It is closer to Arabic and African languages than it is to Romance languages and to Italian. And for that reason, it's very important to understand that in and of itself makes our culture Afro-Sicilian. Our language proves the statement that our identity is indeed Afro-Sicilian. You can't look at or visit or eat Sicilian food or engage with Sicilian people without recognizing those influences. Now, it's also important to understand that in addition to colonization and the imposition of their culture, other things took place as the first wave of Sicilian immigrants came to the United States. And so we should talk about that as well. When my ancestors came, first wave immigrants came from southern Italy. uh, they um, they experienced a lot of prejudice. In fact, the single largest lynching in U.S. history was not against Africans. It was not against the Native American population. It was against the Sicilians, and it took place in New Orleans. And so the fact that our skin color was darker made us the target of the same kind of racism that indigenous people and African enslaved descendants experienced in this country. And so it's important to understand that. It's important to understand that because of that, there would be some attempts to try and hide our identities. And so for me, that's very personal because I'm a second generation Sicilian-American and Hungarian Roma. My on my paternal side, my grandfather, who was actually born in London, England, is was Sicilian in heritage. He had dual citizenship between Sicilia and London and England, but he also had descendants who were Romani, what traditionally gets pejoratively referred to as gypsy. And then my mother's family were Hungarian Roma. And so those both of those cultures, both sides of the family did everything they could to hide who they were. My mother's people came to the United States during the Second World War in order to be able to save themselves from concentration camps. They pretended to be Polish Catholics and then Slovak Catholics to escape. And then once they got here, they just embraced that tradition. And some of the Hungarian Roma traditions remained intact. But for my father's family, it was what took place between that first wave and second wave uh, uh, immigration process that really began to shift what we did publicly and what we did privately. So those who were, are part of my generation and previous were raised in these traditions. That's why you don't hear people like the brilliant Dee Norman and Grace Farron. You don't hear us making ridiculous claims about lineage and about covens or boschetti because we understood that our esoteric tradition, the tradition that we were raised in, was based on our family's worldview. It was not based on religion. There were folk religious practices, folk Catholicism, to be sure, that were hand in hand. We didn't draw lines in the sand and say, okay, so this esoteric practice is Stregoneria. We wouldn't have used the words witchcraft to describe our practices. They were just esotericism because our worldview was that we are magical people, that magic is ours to use. So I was raised in these traditions, and the historical context, the cultural relevance of the Afro-Sicilian practices remained intact. We understood that our descendants came from Tunisia, that they were Carthaginian, that there were some practitioners in our family whose practices were a little bit closer to the Persian and West African practices in some of their esotericism. We also understood something that pop culture pagans don't understand, and that is that there's a difference between religions and our esoteric practice. So folks who read my book, who read Magic at the Crossroads, that was for those who are looking. It's the 10th book in the series of 11 books that I've written. In Magic at the Crossroads, I talk about how there were people in my grandmother's family who wanted me to become part of their boschetto, wanted me to become part of the old religion, which they still practice. And that for me, I was initiated in that religion. I understood that religion very well. It wasn't for me. Religion in general is not for me. Spirituality is. But my worldview didn't require me to be part of any primitive religious traditions. And so when I was asked to take the leadership role because of my academia, because of my doctorate in anthropology, I said no. I suggested that the two of my cousins take the role, and as a result, I was ostracized a bit from some of those family members. But my point is that I understood the difference between religion and esotericism, because in Italy, what we did would never be called witchcraft. People would scoff if you told them the ridiculous story that Charles Leland um, probably made up entirely of whole cloth about the boschetto that he saw. And I've done videos that talk about, what if he did in fact see a ritual take place in a boschetto. Yes, there might have been some practitioners of esotericism and magic there, what we would call in the modern day witches, but it was not a gathering of witches. It was a gathering of devotees to Diana and Dionysus. And so cultural context matters. And in my case, the cultural relevance of being Afro-Sicilian was intact. Now, in the pop culture, we have this nonsensical bullshit story about lineage. And there are many people who've kind of built their reputation on social media or in places like Salem and New Orleans, based on how they claim to come from lineages of Sicilian witches or Italian witches. There's the mentally questionable character who says that she was initiated on Mount Etna and she can control Mount Etna and she controls the weather and all kinds of other, really problematic, um, absurd claims that she makes. The problem is there were no covens in Italy, in Sicilia, in any of that region. There were no covens or boschetti groves of witches because that wasn't part of our culture. That isn't part of our tradition until the 1950s. So if in fact the manic meatball was initiated into a coven, she was initiated into a religion, and that religion would have been based on Wicca, which is not Italian. It has no roots in Tuscany, no matter what Charles Leland tried to say. Um, it was a British tradition with no roots in my culture, no roots in the Afro-Sicilian culture, no roots in the Southern Italian culture, not even any roots in the Northern Italian culture, whose esoteric and magical practices are a little closer to French and Norse practices. So there are people like that who are, in my opinion, parasites who just are profiting. People like Raven Grimassi and people like Lori Bruno, whose claims about their practices can easily be proven to be Wiccan inspired. Wicca with Parmesan cheese and oregano put on it, because you could look at their rituals on YouTube, and you could see that there's nothing that brings any through line to the Afro-Sicilian or Southern Italian esoteric practices that they claim. So their stories about their initiations would would only make sense if they were initiated into Wiccan traditions, which again have nothing to do with our tradition. And then there are culturally deprived and misinformed younger Italian Americans, or Americans with Italian heritage, more accurately, who didn't grow up in a culturally Italian family, whose family were the result of that second wave of immigration, where our traditions were oppressed, where we weren't permitted to speak the language, where it was more important for to those descendants of ours to make sure that we were American. And that would like be the cultures of my younger brothers and sisters and my nieces and nephews and many of my cousins. And so the what happened was those who were esoterically inclined, who had a metaphysical impulse that they connected with, that something that resonated with them, they would have gotten all of their information from pop culture witchcraft, esotericism, Wicca, and both Gardnerian and Alexandrian magic and the Cabot tradition. And so you find some of these social media influencers trying to pretend that they are experts or knowledgeable about our tradition, and they're not. They're making it up as they go along, and what they're really promoting is the same thing that the Manic Meatball and Grimassi and all of them promote. And so it's very unsavory, to say the least. So I just want to say that the content that you find on the Strega Mystica channel represents authentic Sicilian and Southern Italian spiritual tradition. That tradition is rooted in our Afro-Sicilian heritage, period. First wave Sicilian immigrants were forced to hide our racial diversity and, as such, hid a lot of our traditions. But these are practices based on the worldview in which I was raised and my cultural identity as an Afro Sicilian, which is not something that is relatively new. Those who've known me since my childhood, and there are many on social media with whom I remain in close contact, can tell you that has been my cultural identity all along. As it has been with my younger some of my younger siblings as well, where we understood that this was our culture, that the Tunisian people, you need only look at them to see the different the similarities in our appearances and in our traditions and in the foods that we eat. And so what you get on this channel is different from what you get on the opportunists channels, especially in New York City and Salem, some of the other opportunists out there. If you want authentic Southern Italian folk magic, and for whatever reason you don't like me because I'm not everybody's cup of tea, Grace Farron and Dee Norman will never steer you in the wrong direction. And there are others as well. But some of the others have a tendency to blend in their Wiccan practices. And I want to be perfectly clear, there is nothing wrong with that. Just don't pretend that what you're teaching is Afro-Sicilian or Southern Italian esoteric practice. And please don't pretend that there's such a thing as Italian witchcraft. Because until the mid 20th century, when the influences of pop culture witchcraft from Great Britain began to start spreading, and by the 70s and 80s made their way into Italy, there would be no secret initiatory practices. It wasn't how it's not how our culture works. Yes, the things that we learned on Christmas Eve could be considered initiatory, but it wasn't initiation like you see in religious Wicca or religious witchcraft in the Americas and in Great Britain. So I hope this answers your question. I love these kinds of questions, and I will do my best to keep some new content coming out for you. Thanks for taking the time to spend these last 15 minutes or so, and I will look forward to talking to you soon. Take care, everybody. Ci vediamo.